on marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. That idea is being pushed by the European Union, the G77 in China, and various NGOs. And such an agreement might address various issues such as establishment of MPAs on the high seas, where the Arctic could perhaps be the first one, if you wanted to think ahead, enhancement of environmental impact assessment provisions, and clarification of governance principles. And again, countries can't agree if that's the way forward. I'm not going to go into all the detail because of time. We want to leave time for discussion. But just to flag that there has been some procedural advances recently. At the fourth meeting of this working group, they did decide that the way forward was to try to basically put in place a process for identifying gaps and ways forward addressing marine biodiversity, including through implementation of existing instruments and possible development of multilateral agreement under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so we now have this ABNAJ working group. General Assembly has endorsed it as the way forward to have a further meeting in 2013, have a couple workshops in the next year discussing these issues, ways forward. And just at the Rio Plus 20 conference in June 2012, governmental representatives pledged to take a decision on the development of an international instrument under the Law of the Sea Convention before the end of the 69th session of the General Assembly. That's in 2014. It doesn't say you're going to have an implementation agreement. It just says we're going to try to decide by then. So it's still a very contentious issue. And then third, Arctic states could take a proactive approach. And again, it's a menu of things that states could do to take a proactive approach. They can choose to convene a workshop or workshops discuss the preferred policy future for the Arctic area beyond national jurisdiction. They can engage non-Arctic states and actors to understand their governance perspectives, perhaps through an Arctic Ocean Forum. Korea Maritime Institute just hosted with the East-West Center in August a first conference on basically protecting the Arctic marine environment, particularly in the North Pacific. And that was one of the recommendations that came out of their workshop driven by the Korea Maritime Institute. Maybe we need an Arctic Ocean Forum where the non-Arctic states would come in and discuss. Establishing a task force to review law and policy options, and encouraging a precautionary moratorium on future commercial living resource exploitations until appropriate scientific and management parameters are in place. And of course, as anyone in the US knows, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council already has a precautionary moratorium put in place since 2009, so it's not beyond belief that you could actually do that across perhaps the larger Arctic. And there are probably three ways that could be done. You have a multilateral agreement, which has been called for by the Pew Environment Group and other NGOs, a new kind of fisheries agreement that puts in place precautionary moratorium. You could have a UN Sustainable Fisheries Resolution, which would be negotiated every year, where you do that in a soft kind of way, or you can even have an Arctic Council declaration or ministerial statement. Again, when countries want to come in, they would probably want to live up to that statement, because if they don't, then they might not become an observer, for example. There would be a pressure there to make other states follow along. 1 minute yet? I'm going to end with 9 additional challenges, just very quickly. And each one of these could be an hour lecture, and it won't be. Ensuring adequate funding for Arctic Council projects and activities. They've only taken care of the secretariat costs, essentially, and so there's still a huge challenge of adequate funding. Second, improving Arctic marine infrastructure in all kinds of areas. For example, less than 10% of the Arctic is charted for shipping up to modern standards. And we have very limited reception facilities for waste in the Arctic, very limited port facilities, particularly in Alaska, particularly in Canada, better in Russia, better in Norway, but real weaknesses in some countries. Taking a more proactive approaches to toxic chemicals control. Our Stockholm Convention, we now control 22 chemicals for elimination or restriction. Well, guess what? There are 4,300 chemicals that have been identified in that 2009 report that have accumulation potential in the Arctic. Over 50 million chemicals on the Chemical Abstracts Service. So we're not in control yet of the chemicals issues in the Arctic. That'll be a 2-hour lecture if I was getting into that one. Completing negotiation of an effective international agreement on mercury. As maybe you know, we'll have a 5th negotiation session for a global instrument on mercury coming in January, and hopefully by next October we'll have a new global mercury agreement. But again, it's up in the air how strict the controls will be, what kind of financing will be provided for developing countries, those kind of issues. Achieving full ratification of multilateral agreements. The US, for example, is not party to the POPs Convention. Only half of the Arctic states are parties to the Ballast Water Convention. Canada, Norway, Sweden, Russian Federation, the rest are not. Engaging non-Arctic states, I said already, in addressing their impacts on and interest in the Arctic. And this leads into our next speakers, and I'll stop here. Negotiating effective legally binding polar code and identifying and designating a regional network of marine protected areas. That's a huge task, and Lisa will come back to that. And my final slide is a bottom line regarding governance of the Arctic Ocean, a rough and unfinished voyage.
Thanks, David. That was a really wonderful overview, and I'm happy to give you the extra minutes. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Caleb McLennan. He's Director of Marine Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York City. He helps supervise and WCS employ several hundred marine conservationists to work on waters in 20 countries, all 5 oceans, on reversing the decline of endangered species and protecting ecosystems. Through its work, WCS aims to inspire people, among other things, and it has millions of visitors coming to the New York Aquarium and the parks and so forth who I think are inspired by that, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his work in the Arctic.
Thank you very much. I'm also here to speak on...
Oh, do we know how to get your thing up?
I need a keyboard, I think. Oh, got it.
Do you find yours?
It should be already open.
Okay. I think I shut it down earlier by accident. All right, well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I should make a note. So, I'm here to speak on behalf of Martin Robards, who's the director of WCS's Arctic Beringia program, located in Fairbanks, Alaska. So he is our expert on these issues. So I'm going to speak on Arctic shipping. So one of the single issues has been identified by the previous speaker, and I'm going to focus on a particular region within the Arctic where many of the common stressors resulting from shipping are highly acute, and as such, a policy framework is necessary, potentially first before a lot of the global issues are resolved. So Arctic shipping is quite heterogeneous. There's a whole number of different types of vessels moving through the Arctic: tourism, bulk tankers, oil tankers, icebreakers. The potential for Arctic shipping is going to be great. It's going to be a number of different types. Just recently, this massive oil tanker has moved through the Arctic on the northern sea route. And so we're looking at a very different Arctic, as we all know, in the future in terms of global shipping today than it was several years ago. What's driving this is the reduction of summer sea ice, the economic efficiency of Arctic shipping, and obviously continually linearly growing global trade as the world economy develops. This is a common picture of global shipping as we think of it as today. Vast majority of all global shipping happening through the tropical and northern temperate belt, passing through a number of choke points: Straits of Malacca, Panama Canal, Suez Canal, areas where a lot of shipping interests and insurance specialists would be greatly appreciative of not moving through those choke points and those risk factors. You notice currently not a lot moving through the Arctic at all. So why is particularly the northern sea route going over Europe and Asia most desirable? Governance reasons, but also in terms of security, but also 30% shorter in terms of raw economic efficiency. So there's 3 potential shipping seaways. The one that is the most economically relevant in the immediate term is the northern sea route moving over Asia and Europe, connecting Western Europe and East Asia, but also the second most important, the Northwest Passage, as well as the Central Arctic route for icebreakers. Both of the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route are highly available during the summer as the summer sea ice recedes, and the ones most relevant. What we'll notice, though, is that whatever path is chosen, and if our current models of the Northern Sea Route becoming the desired pathway are incorrect, to get into the Pacific Ocean, where most of the global trade needs to go through, you do have to go through the Bering Strait. And so the Bering Strait region becomes the Arctic's choke point, pretty similar to Panama to Straits of Malacca to Suez Canal and the Gulf of Hormuz. This will be the new choke point of the 21st century, and it's quite a narrow place, only 85 kilometers across from Alaska to Russia, And then this is now an old political joke that is perhaps no longer funny, but this is the one place where America and Alaskans can see Russia only 4 miles across. But that is now 4 years old, so that joke is also courtesy of Martin Robards. So. All right, so what does this look like when you look at that AIS data from that is global? You're starting to see, even with the relatively small amount of shipping we have today moving through the Bering Sea region, you get a sense, just looking at this image, of the concentration of the shipping through that choke point, and even through a very small channel in the center of that choke point. So highly relevant for improved governance and thinking about issues in the Arctic in terms of shipping. So we talk about the potential, what are the projections according to the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, and some of the simulations that have been done is that by the end of this decade, we're looking at an increase from about 2 million tons today to over 60 million tons moving through the Arctic and coming through that choke point. So a massive increase in shipping moving through an area. As well, not only in terms of, this is a conservation congress, so that's very interesting geopolitically and in terms of economics, but this is also a very large migration route for a number of, so this is only have figures on marine mammals here, but a number of other organisms marine mammals are using twice a year as the sea ice recedes, and then as it comes back in the winter months, you have large quantities of marine mammals which are obviously surface dependent, highest likely to have shipping interactions, moving through this same choke point. As well as the traditional species that have been moving through this channel, you have new species in increasing numbers as the sea ice retreats. Fin, humpback, and killer whale populations increasing in significant numbers as the Arctic becomes more viable for those populations with the retreating sea ice. So WCS has been working only for several years, launched an Arctic Beringia program to focus on this particular area within the Arctic. It's given its history of extinction of species and also incredible exploitation from a long time ago, but also its future potential that it has in terms of a challenge where a lot of the issues throughout the Arctic will become most acute today. As the shipping increases, as we know, potential impacts are ship strikes are one of the most dominant impacts that we have to figure out how to deal with today, but also accidents, oil spills, a number of other things. This is the ultimate articulation of what happens to a whale when whale meets ship. Besides ship strikes, the other nature of marine wildlife in the Arctic that makes this region quite important, and also we were talking about earlier today, polar regions in general, is the massive aggregating behavior of marine wildlife. So this is right here on the Chukotka Peninsula, 1/2 of the Pacific's walrus population in a single point in time. So 100,000 Pacific walrus and 40% of the global total of walrus, all in a single place. So you imagine a marine accident due to shipping happening, and you can wipe out potentially 1/2 of your Pacific population. So the aggregating behavior that has been strategic for eons that species have evolved to now becomes one of the highest risk elements of their activities. As well, the aggregations historically have been on the sea ice. As the sea ice retreats, they're increasingly on the coastal areas as well, so even more potential for impact. Noise pollution, stress and disturbance. Arctic is historically one of the quietest places on the planet in terms of underwater. As you move from 2 million to 60 million metric tons in the next 8 years, your noise environment is a very different situation than it used to be previously, and these populations haven't had a chance to adapt. And then the people that have been living there and have become dependent on marine species, particularly marine mammals, have a very important linkage, particularly for their #1 protein source of several populations of marine mammals, and have an interest in those populations surviving, but also those populations not having massive changes in their geographic spread due to shipping disturbances. So local indigenous cultures are very concerned about the future of shipping in the Arctic as it relates to potential impacts on their food security. So, as I've said a lot more articulately by the previous speaker, policy change can happen proactively, but more likely it happens as a result of incredible shocks, particularly in the international marine sector. So large ship sinkings such as the Titanic for safety and life at sea, and Marine Pollution Act from the Torrey Canyon is, are we going to be waiting in the Arctic for our huge Arctic disaster to address this as the processes move, or are there certain places in the poles where we're going to have to take more immediate action? And so I'm going to focus as I conclude here on several of the more immediate steps that can be taken in some of the most critical choke points. So the Polar Code, as has been previously talked about, is particularly focused on improving vessel construction and safety requirements and operation requirements in Arctic waters. And there's several tiers of classifications for different time spent in different waters that have certain amounts of ice cover. So the Polar Code, while awaiting some larger Arctic regime, can, under the rules of the IMO, create restrictions as to how vessels are constructed and operate to minimize the risk of accident and to minimize the operations when they're working in the area. As well as the construction of the vessels and in minimizing the chance of some sort of accident or routes that are unsafe. We also have the port access route study being conducted in the US to look at the most safe routes for vessels to travel through the Arctic. There's not a lot of control or traffic separation schemes right now at all in the Arctic to say where vessels should go for safety. As well, particularly sensitive sea areas under the IMO. Just a quick review of the map of particularly sensitive sea areas. You see they're all in tropical and temperate waters. As noted for both sessions today, there are no particular sensitive sea areas in either polar region of the planet. So we must have, particularly sensitive sea areas have to have some some component of them that is vulnerable to the impacts of shipping, and then can have a number of rule restrictions under the IMO. And just to move quickly, some of the types of rule restrictions you can get through particular sensitive sea areas are piloting measures to have a pilot has intimate local knowledge of those waters on board the vessel as it is moving and navigating through, ship routing measures, no anchoring restrictions, and actually restricted no-go areas as much as is safely possible. And that is the most popular measure to take under particularly sensitive sea areas. So this is a potential mechanism to use in the intermediate time before, if it takes a longer time for Arctic regime to emerge. This slide has been up in a lot of marine spatial planning exercises, but just to articulate the idea of moving a traffic separation scheme. This is an example from Massachusetts, where I'm from, where the whale populations in Stellwagen Bank, the distribution was such that the current traffic separation scheme went right through one of the highest abundance areas. So in order to minimize ship strikes, the traffic separation scheme was moved and has reduced the chances of ship strikes accordingly. So these types of controls can have a significant impact without going through a large international process for the entire regime. So some of the types of rules taken under the traffic separation scheme in Boston are routing measures, mandatory ship reporting, and really critical for marine mammals that are surface dependent is slowing the speed. As we know, as the speed of vessels increases, the likelihood and the incidences of ship strike increases as well. So in closing, the challenge as the Arctic changes, as the ice recedes, is we have an increased interaction between human populations, marine wildlife, and human economic development and industry, in this case, shipping and marine wildlife, and is increasing not only the wildlife that has been there, but new wildlife and biodiversity that is coming into the region. It's beginning, and it will continue more and more today. This is a population of walrus off the coast of Chukotka coming ashore. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caleb. That's really good. Our last speaker in the Arctic segment is Lisa Spear. I think most people know Lisa. She works for NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council in the U.S. She has a long history of involvement on Arctic and high seas governance issues, as well as a lot of other issues like I mentioned in the past. She has a broad range of experience in various international forums and plays a key role in advancing ocean conservation issues internationally. Lisa? And we have to find your
Yeah, if you could help me.
Get us how this
All right, Dorothy.
our expert here.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks particularly for the reminder of how long I've been working on these issues. And it's a real pleasure to follow these two terrific speakers we had earlier. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about sort of some of the changes underway in the region and what they mean for the critters and for the management of new human activities. This is a picture of sea ice extent 3 days ago on September 8th. As most of the people in this room probably know, the summer sea ice limit has been falling pretty dramatically, and most recently in the last couple of weeks has fallen below the previous low, which was 2007. So the loss of sea ice in the Arctic is huge, dramatic, and exceeding by far the most pessimistic of the projections that had been anticipated in the past. And how do I advance this? Thank you. And this is another depiction of it. This is a median, the average, with 2 standard deviations on either side between 1979 and